Okay. All right. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's a few minutes after 6 o'clock here. So this is a mixture of folks from the Harvest Gwinnett Community Gardens and also Master Gardeners, some friends of Master Gardeners, and some Master Gardener alums. So tonight we're going to talk about the Great Pollinator Census. So that's coming up here very quickly. It's on August 19th and 20th, which is going to be here before you know it. That's next week, I think, coming up really quick. And so I've been making my way around to a handful of the community gardens and doing some in-person trainings on how to do the census. We're kind of running into year 4 here. So quite a few of you probably know how to do it, and that's great. But there's a lot of newbies that are just coming in on the Harvest Gwinnett side that maybe would like to know a little bit more about it. And I'm here to kind of give you a much broader overview of how it came into being, how the Great Pollinator Census came into being, and give you some of the data that they've collected already, not exhaustive data, but just some so that you can kind of see what a difference we're making. And then just a short training session on what kind of insects we'll be looking for, how to identify them, maybe a little quiz so that you can see if you're proficient in identifying your insects, and then we'll answer some questions. So I've let people in, I've muted you, and I appreciate that. If you don't unmute yourself, and then at the very end, I'll ask if there's any questions. But if you do come up with anything while I'm talking, feel free to put that in the chat box. So I will get that as I'm finished up. Hopefully I'll be able to round this out in an hour. I'll talk fast and I hopefully won't linger on too much, but here we go. All right. Okay. So everybody knows what pollination is. It's a transfer of pollen from male parts of a flower to the female parts of the flower. Most of us are familiar with it with regards to our vegetable gardens. You also have that with flower gardens and trees, nut producing trees, that kind of thing. But as a statistic, it's pretty impressive when you look at the annual value of this, that in Georgia alone, which has a lot of agriculture in it, mostly in the southern parts of the state, but also up in the northern parts, that back in 2014, so we can guess that it's probably more now, that was over $360 million just for this state alone. So knowing that we're already, closing on a decade from this, you can probably value it closer to, my guess would be 500 million, especially with inflation. And that you're looking at a global or a worldwide number of somewhere between 235 and $577 billion. So that's pretty impressive. And that means that we really require our pollinators to do a lot of heavy lifting for us. And probably the most famous are honeybees, of course, but there are a lot of other pollinators out there that we want you all to become more aware of. And hopefully in becoming more aware of, you'll do some things around your own houses to try to help their habitat. So talking about bees, bees typically outperform all other pollinators because of their need for pollen and nectar. They can carry it very easily, and they are very quick to fly from flower to flower. But again, as I mentioned, there are a lot of other pollinators out there. So you'll have flies and solitary bees, like little sweat bees, wasps, moths, beetles, and butterflies. And I didn't mention hummingbirds here, but there are some birds that are actually pretty efficient at pollinating. The EPA had asked states back in, it's like 2014 is when they started it, but they asked them to kind of come up with a pollinator protection plan. So it was on the horizon, and we realized that there were some issues. Honeybees had been struggling for a while because of the varroa mite. Some of you may know that, some of you may not. Prior to the early 80s, honeybees were very easy to harvest honey from. You didn't have to do a whole lot of anything. You would just basically go and harvest the honey from the hive, and the bees were, happy, and they did their thing and we did our thing. It was great. But then we had the introduction of the varroa mite, and life got a lot more difficult. We had issues with colony collapse disorder. It was kind of a perfect storm of pesticides, carelessness with that, the varroa mite, and other factors that were really knocking the populations down. So at that time, a lot of the different stakeholders, and we'll kind of go over which ones those are, but know that Georgia played a very important part, kind of all got together and said, we need to do something. Let's do something to increase the awareness of pollinators. So they did a pollinator protection plan. And it's kind of centering around maintaining healthy managed bee colonies, minimizing pesticide exposures, conserving and supplementing pollinator habitats. And that goes for all pollinators, not just honeybees, but a lot of the pollinators that aren't as well known. And we'll talk about those here in a bit. So this is a screenshot of what the front of the manual looks like. When we're doing the pollinator census in a week or so, we'll have probably some of these at our display tables. Unfortunately, I don't have enough that people can take them home, but you can certainly pick it up and flip through it and take a look at it. And it's relatively simple, honestly, but it did take a lot of effort from a lot of different agencies to kind of dive in and put this together. Oops, I apologize. That one kind of flew off the edge of the screen there when I was adding in the bees. Hang on one second. I am going to stop sharing and go back and look at that and see what's going on. That's what happens when you mess around with things. Suddenly the formatting changes. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on there again. I apologize. So I don't know. Anyway, okay, so part of this pollinator protection plan had stakeholders and folks, customers who all have an interest in pollinators, and that's us because we get food from all of that, to kind of, let's look at our yards. What can we do to try to help them? A lot of us have very well manicured yards. Some of us have nicely landscape yards for pollinators and other animals, and they're more naturalized with native plants and things like that. So, if you have one of the more manicured yards, let's see what we can do to try to naturalize that a little bit, keeping in mind HOAs and all, but let's become more aware of what's out there and how can we do a little bit within our own little pocket of property to try to help those pollinators.
You're not sharing your slides anymore. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, though. Thank you for telling me. Okay, let me try this again. I would rather someone tell me that than I just keep talking and nobody says anything. So, all right. Can you see them now?
Not yet.
No.
No?
No.
No, I don't like stuff like this. Hang on a second. All right.
Yep, you got it.
There. Okay. All right, we'll go back to here. Don't y'all love technology? Okay. Now can you see it? Formatting's a little off, but hopefully you can see that. Okay, so for those that have maybe a more manicured yard, this pollinator protection plan kind of prompts you to think about what can you do within the framework of your yard to try to promote habitat. Well, if you have sunny areas and shady areas, maybe you want to leave some areas, like you can see here, we've got ground nesting bees. We have mason bees and leaf cutters and that kind of thing. We also have the ground bees. Maybe you leave a little area open that was, just bare soil, and that's for the bees. Maybe you provide some nest building materials. You can put in some different types of plants, like for the leaf cutters, they really like red buds for some odd reason, and they were pretty active this year. I had quite a few of them in my solitary bee houses. So start thinking of things that you can do within your habitat to try to help the bees. Okay, consider creating a, oops. I don't know why it's, sorry for all these technical things. Normally there we go, we'll just move that down. Y'all can't see it, but I can see stuff. Consider creating a dedicated pollinator space in your landscape. So use plants that provide both nectar and pollen. And then you want to add, of course, a few host plants for butterflies to provide food for the larval stage of butterflies, like parsley and fennel. So I know a lot of you probably heard the news. It was very sad. I think it was last week. There were news reports that came out that the monarch is now basically endangered. We've gotten down to about 97% of what the population used to be. So trying to think of ways that we can help the monarch is great. And there's a lot of different ideas. I've looked at some information on the best ways to do that. And I'd learned some interesting facts. Typically, only about 10% of the caterpillars that emerge every year survive. And so I know some folks out there actually collect the caterpillars, not just of monarchs, but other butterflies as well, and then raise them in captivity. And I did a little reading on that too. And that was an interesting fact, in that if you're doing 8 or less, you're probably fine. It's the folks that are raising hundreds of them every year that are actually contributing to the bad part of that, and that is that they're passing on viruses that normally wouldn't be a problem, because all of the caterpillars that they're raising in captivity are then transmitting those viruses to the wild population, where normally you wouldn't have that many insects and that close a contact with one another. You're seeing that kind of stuff in captivity. So I did want to point that out, because I know there's probably some of you out there that enjoy doing that, and it's fine in a limited form, but try to not do it in where you're raising hundreds of them each year. And then you also want to kind of plant for a succession of bloom from early spring until frost. And that's good for all pollinators, butterflies, bees, everything. A lot of folks complain that we get calls that they're not getting as many vegetables out of their gardens as they would have hoped. And one of the easy things that you can do is plant pollinator plants in pots or nearby, either in and around, or even right in the middle of. And if you don't have spots in your in the area, like you're in raised beds, you can certainly put pots out right next to it. But we see at a lot of the community gardens that gardeners are actually planting those in amongst their vegetables. And that's perfect, because that attracts the pollinators, and then that gets more of them to your vegetables. So you get more vegetables. And so I've got a little bloom chart here. You can find these all over the internet. This one isn't specifically for Georgia, but there are all sorts of these out there on the internet, and you can easily come across them and plot out what you're going to be putting in your yard. Get to know the beekeepers in your area. So part of what's on the pollinator census, there is a question that says, Do you know if there's a beekeeper in the area? And a lot of you won't, and that's perfectly okay. But if you do know, and go ahead and put that down, because what you might find is that those little honeybees have found the pollinating plants and are coming to your pollinating plants. And so they want to be able to smooth the data and account for those extra honeybees if there are beekeepers in the area. And also, as an aside, you want to also be careful about pesticide applications. So if you know that your neighbor has a couple of hives, obviously, if you're going to be doing any spraying, that you want to be careful to do that either early in the morning or do it later in the afternoon, early evening, so that the bees are already back in the hive and you don't have to worry about them coming in contact with any pesticides. You want to provide nesting sites for bees. So I love these pictures. These are actually from one of the bulletins that we have that we put out, and you can see that down at the bottom. That's circular 1125, and that's creating pollinator nesting boxes. So this was a Becky Griffin bulletin circular, whatever you want to call it. But anything works. I mean, I have a couple, I got them at Tractor Supply, and that's perfectly fine. You can get them at Dollar General, and you can make your own by just drilling holes in pieces of branches from a downed tree from storm or something like that. The bugs don't care. I think that's the point I'm trying to get across. They will find a cavity anywhere, but you can certainly help them out by making lots of extra habitat. And I like to put them on my front porch and watch the bees come in. It's actually pretty interesting, and you can kind of track the different species across the summer as they reproduce, because I'll have a group of one particular species, and then they'll finish up and seal off their cells, and then I'll get more, and I can see going through the summer what's out there. So it's kind of a good educational experience. So you can see here anywhere from a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch hole, and they need to be at least 3 inches deep. I know there's data out there, I'm sure you've probably all heard it, where it says that the length of those cavities need to be like 6 inches deep. That's not the case. Their bees are not super picky. They're going to pick whatever cavity they can find at that particular diameter, and they're going to lay their eggs in there. Are you going to get more cells if you have 6 inches? Sure. But the bee will use a 3-inch deep hole. So please don't stress about that. The tunnels have to terminate in some type of a dead end. So don't have a completely hollow straw or reed. Bamboo makes a really excellent type of tunnel for the bees, and you'll see that in a lot of the bee houses that they use bamboo. But that's a good use. If you have golden bamboo that's growing out in the back 40, grab some of that, and just make sure it's the correct diameter. But you can put it in anything, a coffee can, anything. I mean, you probably have all sorts of plastic stuff in your pantry that you could use there too. If you don't have that, then you can use rolled up cardboard. Just make sure it's the correct diameter, and you can fold that and then stick that in there, and that'll be a terminated, you'll have it terminate in the end. But the bees will find these spots. I think that's probably the biggest thing, is that, I put mine out, I guess it's probably been a couple years, and I was amazed at how quickly they found the house, and they've continued to come back. Now I have to clean it out after this year and get some new tunnels for them. But for the most part, they find it really quickly. Just make sure it's in a sheltered area, like a porch or something like that, that they have ready access to it. So educating gardeners about insect behaviors in your landscape, that's another important part of this plan. And so you want to kind of learn about the flight and the nesting behaviors of these solitary bees. I showed you on that first slide that you couldn't really see, and I had to go back to it again. But when you're out there in the spring, usually it's in June, and you'll see all these little, look like anthills, but they're not. They're actually from the solitary bees. And we get calls saying, hey, I've got all of these anthills in my yard. What am I going to do about them? And we always tell folks, give us a picture so we can see. So people will email that to us, and we tell them that that's actually not an anthill. Those are solitary bees. And then they get even more scared. So then we have to kind of talk them off the ledge and say, no, 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 that's a good thing. They'll be gone in like a week. But if you can just let them be, yes, pun intended, it will be great, and just leave them. And so a lot of people are good about that. And they're like, yeah, I'll wait to cut my grass. It's okay. But they typically nest in spring or summer. And you'll see them flying out of the tunnels, and they'll hover around the garden or in the grass. They're pretty gentle. They rarely sting. So just let them do their thing, and their life cycle, complete it, and they'll be on their way. But they're a good pollinator as well. So we want to make sure we protect them. Okay, so IPM. Some of you know what IPM is. That's integrated pest management, and that's a big thing for extension. A lot of times people, and for actually a really long time, probably since, I don't know, the 50s or 60s, they saw a bug and the first thought was, what am I going to spray to kill this? And we're trying to get people to kind of look away from that. We don't want people to kill all the bugs in their yard, because not all of them are bad. Some of them are, squash bugs, vine borers, things like that. They cause a lot of problems, but there's ways to manage that, and there's ways to do that without using pesticides first thing. So integrated pest management uses biological, cultural, mechanical, physical, and chemical controls before you get to the pesticides. So there are some chemicals, they fall into the organic range. I'll go into that in a little bit. But before you hit the synthetic big guns to kill whatever it is, there's all sorts of steps you can go through that will help your yard and keep the levels of chemicals that you're using or synthetic pesticides to a minimum. So for instance, using good cultural practices by planting disease-resistant cultivars. You can look at tomatoes. A lot of people have problems with blight. Me included, and now there are some blight-resistant tomatoes. So I'm actually able to have tomatoes in my raised beds now after years of really not being able to do that, because now we have some varieties that we can. We can also maintain healthy soil. So a lot of you, especially the master gardeners who've gone through this before, we know soil is the basis of everything. So if your pH is off, or you don't have enough potassium or phosphorus or some of the micronutrients, your plants aren't going to be healthy, and they're going to struggle. And when they're struggling, that's when you have problems, and that kind of opens you up to your insect pests and funguses and some bacterial issues. So making sure that your plant is healthy by having healthy soil, very important. You also want to use appropriate types and amounts of fertilizer. And you want to use best watering practices. So many of you have probably heard it makes a lot more sense when you're watering your garden to do it for, let's say half an hour or an hour, and deeply water your plants once a week instead of watering for 5 minutes, 3 times a week, because that water is going to sink into the ground. Those roots will be able to utilize that, and your plant will be healthier than if you have very, very shallow root systems because you didn't do that. You also want to monitor pests. You want to go out there, flip the leaves over, look for eggs. If you see them, squish them, those little bronze eggs. You want to get rid of them, because it's always easier to squish 20 eggs than it is to chase 20 nymphs versus 20 adult beetles that are crawling all across your beans and eating the leaves, isn't it? Most of those are going to be a lot simpler to kill when they're soft-bodied than versus when their exoskeletons have hardened. So make sure that when you're identifying your pests, you get the right pest. And we're always here at Extension. So if you don't know what it is, just reach out. We're happy to identify whatever it is that you might have or think you have a problem with. And then the biggest thing is have an action threshold. So when we give the IPM talk, that action threshold is actually a big part of it. And that is, we want you to have a level where you just won't tolerate any more pest damage. So if everything is below that, then you're just going to keep scouting, you're going to keep squishing eggs, you're going to keep, doing all of that, but you're not going to use any preventive fungicides or anything else in there. So just, kind of keep that in mind. And that will make your ecosystem in your yard a lot healthier when you're doing things like that. Okay, so this is a IPM pyramid, and it's an easy way to just visually kind of look at that. And you can see the cultural, physical, mechanical, biological, and chemical uses. So just like the food pyramid, you've got your IPM pyramid. So at the bottom with cultural, choosing where you're going to put your plants. So site, best plant, right place, plant selection, sanitation, getting all the dead stuff out, and rotation within a garden. So don't always plant the same thing in the same spot. Physical and mechanical, insect traps, barriers, weeding, mulch, tilling and pruning, that kind of stuff. Biological, predators, parasites. You've probably seen some of the parasitic wasps on caterpillars. Kind of creepy to look at, but very efficient. Nematodes, and then up at the top is chemicals. So you're going to use some type of organic or biopesticide first. So that'd be like insecticidal soap, neem oils, baking sodas, repellents, things like that. BT is a good one in there. And then up at the very top, you have your synthetic or conventional types of pesticides. So keep this in mind when you are thinking about ways of taking care of stuff in your yard and your garden, ornamentals and your vegetables. So the role of the homeowner and landowner, again, you want to avoid systemic insecticides in soils, flowers, trees, or shrubs that bloom and attract bees, because it's systemic. So it's going to move through the whole plant. That means it's also in the pollen and the nectar. So you really don't want that to get carried back to the hive. So you have to be a good steward of the pollinators. And if you have to apply some type of insecticide for turf pests, then mow your grass first to get rid of any of the flowers that would attract the bees, and then apply the insecticide. Of course, following and reading all labels, that's something that we teach with regards to getting your pesticide license. And you want to look for the protection of pollinators advisory box, so that you can, or the bee hazard icon, to make sure that you're not, that you know whether or not it's detrimental to pollinators, so that when you do apply it, you're applying it the correct way, the correct time. So consider making a pollinator plan for your yard and using it as a kind of a family affair. If you have kids, get the kids out there and get them planting, teach them about the different types of plants. You can get all of these certifications. So one that we'll talk about occasionally is the Georgia Green Landscape. You probably already qualify for that. A lot of you do in your own yard. There's 70 or 72 different questions, and I think you have to have a third of those, say yes to a third of those. There's a website, and you can go and get that checklist. And then if you fit the bill and your yard works, then they send you this awesome little sign that you can put out in your yard that says Georgia Green Landscape. You've got other pollinator habitat, Xerxes Society, I definitely recommend reaching out to a lot of these and seeing what you can do and how you can support their can't think of that, lack of the better word, but their program, I guess. All right, let's talk about the Great Georgia Pollinator Census. So this year, it's on the 19th and the 20th, which is coming up next week. And that's where we have everybody who's going to be a citizen scientist. So you guys hopefully are the ones that are here so that you can learn a little bit more about the program and answer some questions. If you're hosting an event at your school or your garden or even in your neighborhood, maybe you're going to have your neighbors come over and do it. But hopefully you'll get enough information here from what I've provided to answer some of those questions and give them a little bit of education, in addition to showing them how to actually identify these insects and then do the count. So this is a pretty much of a comprehensive training. I want you guys to have everything you need to feel like you're going to be a success for getting out there and getting the data for us. So as I mentioned, anyone can participate. It's great for after school clubs too. We'll have, and I'll show later on, we have a whole bunch of events that are public events here in Gwinnett County at a lot of the parks. Some private businesses are also doing them. And I know a lot of the schools are doing them also. So that's great. I'm just, every year it grows and it's fantastic. So the goals of the pollinator census, we want to create and add to the sustainable pollinator habitat across Georgia. So that means adding new gardens and adding new plants. So if you can add some plants to your yard, go for it. That's great. It'll make the bugs happier and it makes us happier because, there's more habitat across the state for the insects. We also want to increase entomological literacy of our citizens. So we get lots of emails and calls. Oh, I have these honeybees and they're driving me crazy when my kids eat outside at the picnic table during lunch. And we get the picture and it's a yellow jacket. So know that different insects have different habitats and actions and what they feed on. And so being able to identify a bee versus a yellow jacket is very important. So we want folks to understand a little bit about how these insects act so that we can take away a little bit of the frighteningness, scaredy stuff that people start to think of when they think of bees and wasps and all of that. And then lastly, we want folks to know that we get a lot of really good usable data from this. So we can track our pollinator populations. So as we do this every year, and actually South Carolina is joining us this year, we get data points and we add all those in, and all that data is very valuable because we can look at population trends. And so just like, unfortunately, the poor monarch has kind of fallen into that endangered category, although I don't think they actually listed it. This is a way where we can watch trends, and perhaps there's a problem on the horizon and we need to see about heading that off. And so this will help us by looking at broad categories to see if we're seeing a decrease in observations due to some type of a problem. Okay, now we have data. So I didn't have this last year, and I'm really excited about this because this shows that the census and the citizen scientist aspects of it are really making a difference. So you can see here we have 2019, 2020, and 2021. We have the state of Georgia. And these are small pollination gardens, so something under 1/4 of an acre. It could be like the size of a raised bed or something like that. But Gwinnett, if you notice there in the middle, you can pick out Gwinnett there. It has led the state with the creation of new small and medium pollinator gardens, and we'll see the medium on the next slide. Some of it is because of extension and us getting out there and bugging you guys from one end of Gwinnett County to the other, like, hey, we need to put some gardens in, we need to get some pollinator plants out, that kind of thing. But a lot of it is just the teamwork that we've had, both with Harvest Gwinnett and also UGA getting out there and all the education on pollinators. It's just been fantastic. And we're just so excited and proud of how hard Gwinnett County has worked at creating all of these awesome new pollinator gardens. So you can see here under, 1/4 an acre over the course of 2019 to 2021. And I'm excited to see what 2022 offers after we've kind of gotten through the worst of COVID, in my opinion. But we still have a lot of folks who are interested in gardening and want to learn. So we hope that we'll again see almost exponential growth in the number of pollinator gardens. So this is medium. This is 1/4 acre to 1 acre. So that's an awful lot of pollinator plants. It could be, a meadow area. It could be somebody decided that they were going to stop mowing their backyard, and so they just started planting all sorts of pollinator plants. But you can see that Gwinnett County has consistently added in somewhere between 15 and 23 of these over the course of 2019, 2020, and 2021. And in 2021, they were really the only county that did that well. So, something to really be proud of. I mean, I'm excited about that. And then looking at large pollinator gardens, so over an acre, this would be something like DOT would do. Some of the other counties are a little higher than us. We're pretty suburban. Not a lot of space left to have any really large gardens, but we definitely are excelling in the small and medium sized. All right, a little bit more data. So I don't have much on the insects themselves. We had kind of a blip with COVID in there because that really dropped the number of observations we had for very obvious reasons. And I don't have access to do any statistical smoothing. So I'm waiting to get some from Becky Griffin. But in the meantime, I can put some stuff together on the number of counts. And we've seen, even in 2020, we saw an increase from the previous year. So hoping that we'll get in Gwinnett County upwards of 500 counts this year. That would be really nice. And then in participation, you can see there schools, garden clubs, the county would be like county parks and private businesses. So yeah, there's a blip with COVID, but we saw a nice rebound and hopefully we'll see more this year. So it's a good thing. It's really getting the public awareness out there. Okay, so moving on. Making sure that your pollinator garden includes plants that will be blooming in August. So obviously that's a given. Some people don't think about that. So it does require that you put a little bit of thought in as to what you're going to have there to bloom. You see a bunch of zinnias here. Zinnias are perfect flowers for that. They are in full bloom right now and the pollinators love them. Plus they're cheap and they reseed and they're so colorful. So many different varieties. So they're an excellent choice, even in a pot if you had them or a raised bed. They're one of my favorite flowers. So this is a example of plants that should be blooming now and will be blooming next week. So mountain mint, a favorite of a lot of little wasp species, asters, they're kind of almost on the way out, but you see some plants that still have them. Hot lip salvia, I've got some of that. It was probably blooming more in earlier summer, but still around. Sedum, that's blooming, starting to bloom now. You've got orange cosmos. Those are always a favorite of pollinators. Zinnias, of course. Swamp sunflowers, right now they're blooming. Lantana, see a lot of that. Rudbeckia, or the black-eyed Susans, and coneflower. So lots of really colorful, pretty plants that the pollinators love. Don't say that fast 5 times because you'll probably trip over your tongue. But yeah, there are lots of really pretty flowers out there that you can definitely count on to give you that color that you need at that by next week. So participants are going to count insects into these categories. So these categories do not change. They are the same every single year. And that includes carpenter bees, bumblebees, honeybees, small bees, wasps, flies, butterflies and moths, and other insects. So every year the categories will be the same. So Gwinnett County is kind enough to give us some decent marketing materials. And if you are hosting one of our public events, you'll be getting those, early next week. And I do have some limited ones if you're wanting to do a private event like at your house or something, and you're welcome to swing by and we can provide some of those to you. Just reach out to me. I'll have my information at the end. All right, let's look at the categories. So the first category is the Carpenter Bee. And I know we have a love-hate relationship with these guys, but they are very valuable pollinators. So carpenter bees, the easiest way to tell a carpenter bee from a bumblebee is going to be that their rear end has no hair. So their abdomen is going to be shiny black. And, most of them are going to be roughly the same size as a bumblebee, but that rear end on the abdomen, that is the easiest way to tell. You also will see, because not everybody looks at the metric system and knows exactly what 22 millimeters is. I've put a little ruler down at the bottom so you can see what 1 inch is, and then 16 to 22 millimeters. That's about the biggest that you will see of one of these guys. So they're not really big, but they're probably one of the bigger types of pollinators that we'll be looking at. So they tend to have lots of hair on their head and their thorax, which is that middle section, and they'll have yellow and black bands, just pretty much like a bumblebee. And then the males have a yellow or white coloring on their face. So they'll have this little dot. And a lot of times they have a habit of, they'll just kind of cruise in front of you and they'll look at you. And that's a little creepy. I used to call them creepy bees when I was younger. But ultimately, they're probably not going to mess with you if you leave them alone. So just remember that if they have a shiny abdomen, they are carpenter bees. So now on with bumblebees. Bumblebees have a hairy abdomen. So like I said, the easiest way to tell the difference is that the bumblebees will have a hairy abdomen, hairy rear end, and the carpenter bees have a shiny rear end. And they tend to be a fairly fat bee with a small head. So a large thorax area and abdomen and a tiny little head, whereas the carpenter bee's head tends to be a little bit bigger. You can see they're similar in size to the carpenter bee, which is when I have the ruler down there, and that's why people tend to confuse them. But once you know how to distinguish them, it's pretty easy to tell them apart. And here you can see a little bumblebee, and she's got the pollen in her pollen basket, which is also called a corbicula. And they tend to have also the very long antennae. And here's a good example of the carpenter bee and the bumblebee next to each other, so you can tell the difference. And this is from Becky Griffin. This was her little catchphrase, that a bumblebee has a fuzzy bum and a carpenter bee has a shiny hiney. Somebody told me that's from somewhere upstate New York, is when you say hiney. So I didn't know that. I learned that the other day. All right, honeybees. So honeybees most people can identify them when they see them out on a flower. They're smaller than a bumblebee, smaller than a carpenter bee. They're in the 12 to 15 millimeter range. So they're closer to like a half an inch, maybe right at about a half an inch. A big one would be going closer to 3/4 of an inch. And you'll see they have the typical brown or black stripes on their body. They have these golden brown hair on their abdomen, not super thick like a bumblebee, but thick enough. And you've got an example of a European and an Italian honeybee. Those are the ones that you'll see here. We don't have killer bees, so nobody has to worry about that. And comparing the differences between a honeybee and a bumblebee, you can see they're pretty easy to tell the difference. Bumbles tend to have the white or the yellowy color and black bands, and they tend to be a lot furrier or hairier than the honeybees do. Next is our small bees, and these are going to be like our sweat bees. So you see up at the top, you have, I think that's mountain mint, you've got a mining bee, and then down below a furrow bee, and then you have a leaf cutter bee. So your leaf cutters these are all solitary bees, but you have a leaf cutter. Those are the ones that you'll find in your bee houses, and they'll go cut those semicircular areas out of leaves, and that's what they use to block off their cells in those bee boxes. So they're actually pretty cool looking. So if you ever see any of these semicircular cutout areas in leaves, like in your red buds, but any tree is fair game, that's because you have leaf cutter bees. So small bees, in this case, for the pollinator census, are any bee that's going to be smaller than a honeybee. So these are sweat bees, essentially. They're going to be your metallic. A lot of times they're green. They might be blue. Sometimes you'll see them, they're, a golden color, but those are all going to be small bees. We're not interested in teasing them out to species. We just label them all as small bees. And you can see here with the size, they're down around 1/4 of an inch, give or take. So they're pretty small, definitely a lot smaller, which bumble or your carpenter bee would be around 20 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch. These guys are, only 1/4 of an inch. Flies. So a lot of people don't think of flies as pollinators, but they are. So here you have, you've got a crane fly at the bottom, and a tachnid fly, and then a long-legged fly, and a blue bottle fly. And those are all pollinators. And we just kind of forget about them. We think, especially the bottle flies, that they just like trash or other things. But they too also are pollinators, and they deserve to be counted just like anything else. So you've got the bee mimics also. We're going to throw that in there. So I'm trying to give a little interesting tidbit of information here and there. So these guys are flies that look like a bee. So you can see here bees, and there'll be a slide, the next slide, and it'll talk a little bit more about the differences. But flies have one set of wings, bees have two sets of wings. But this guy is very smart, because if you look at his abdomen, it looks an awful lot like a bee, doesn't it? And if you were a bird or something else that was thinking of eating a fly, but knew to stay away from bees because they can sting, this little insect has figured out that mimicking a bee is a good thing. So this, in this case, is Batesian mimicry. There's several types. And this one, this little guy, has very small antennae, and the eyes are close together. But you know, as I mentioned before, bees have two sets of wings, whereas flies only have the one. And they don't have that corbicula that the bee has because it's a fly. So these are the type of mimics, and you've got the Batesian mimic and the Mullerian mimics. You have a true predator in the middle that would be a wasp that would sting. And then with the Batesian, you have a harmless insect like the fly that mimics that dangerous organism. And with Mullerian, you have a resemblance between the two, and it also has warning systems. So you can have a bee that can sting just like a wasp can, and they look similar to a wasp in coloring. So they too also benefit from being able to look like that to anything that might want to eat it, that says, stay away from me because I will sting you. So is it a bee or a fly? Well, that's a good question. You may see some of these guys when you're out there. You have bee flies, which are very furry like bees, but are actually flies. And you have hover flies, which live up to their name. They basically hover there. And then drone flies. So you might see some of these guys out there. And if you see one and you're curious and you're not quite sure, wait until it lands and then count the number of wings that it has. If it only has one set, it's a fly. Wasps. So we kind of forget about these guys, but they are actually really good pollinators also. So you have paper wasps and a potter wasp here. But there are others. They generally have a hairless abdomen, and they have that very tapered abdomen with a very, very narrow waist, kind of like an ant does. And you don't often see yellow jackets on flowers. So that's a very easy way to kind of tease apart which ones might be there and might not be there. You can also see that these guys are closer, most of them are closer to an inch, although we do have some smaller ones. If you have mountain mint, they probably, mine not so much right now, it's about almost done blooming, but back a couple weeks ago it was absolutely covered in wasps. They love that particular plant. Okay, and this is just kind of an interesting slide to take a look at. Is it a bee? Is it a fly? Is it a wasp? It's just a way to kind of look at the two. So, you know, I will post this recording on our Metro Master Gardener page, and I'll have a link. So you're welcome to go watch that if you're interested, and you can take a picture of this. It's just kind of interesting. It's a good way of being able to tell the different insects apart until you're, you know, really good at IDing things. All right, butterflies and moths. So butterflies, we have just an example of the Gulf fritillaries. We're seeing a lot of those now, gray hair streaks, and of course monarchs. And moths. So you have scape moths, webworm moths, and then of course the sphinx or the hawk moth. So those are also, so your tomato hornworms. I always tell folks, plant some extra tomato plants just for these guys, because that's what you end up with. You end up with one of these really cool hawk moths, and there are all sorts of different species out there. There's some that are on gardenias. There's some that are on hydrangeas. This year was apparently a bumper crop for the particular species that utilizes oak leaf hydrangeas, because both of mine in my backyard were stripped bare. So I just, let them go. I mean, the leaves will grow back. It's been long enough through the summer that they're fine, and they've already started to put out new leaves. So I'm not particularly worried about it. I know it can be maddening, but these guys are so cool. When you see them, they do look like a little hummingbird. And then we have our other category. So this is a katydid, but you can have all sorts of different insects out there. Ambush bugs, you've got a praying mantis. These are not pollinators. Some of them are predators, but it kind of gives us an idea of what kind of, if we're seeing problems in other populations, we might see problems in the bugs that are predators or are just kind of there. So it's just a good way to collect some extra data while we're at it. That's just a lady beetle and a wheel bug. Okay, quiz time. So nobody has to unmute themselves and tell me what this is, unless you really just want to do it. But this is going to be just a quick quiz to see if you can identify what the insect is. So what is this? Is it a carpenter bee, bumblebee, honeybee, small bee, wasp, fly, butterfly, or moth? Guesses? Does anybody want to volunteer?
Honeybee.
Honeybee? That's right. It's a honeybee. Yay. Good job. All right. Next up, we've got something on this blue flower here. Is that a carpenter bee, a bumblebee, a honeybee, small bee, wasp, fly, butterfly, or moth?
Small bee.
Yes, small bee. That's right. It falls into the small bee category. And the easiest way is usually they're metallic. That's the best way to tell them. Green sweat bee. Okay, so is this one a carpenter bee, bumblebee, honeybee, small bee, wasp, fly, butterfly, or moth, or an other?
Come on, somebody answer.
Come on. Is its abdomen shiny or fuzzy?
It's a carpenter bee.
Yes. Yes, it's a carpenter bee. Definitely. Perfect. All right. This one should be easy. What is this?
A fly.
That's right. It's a fly. Green bottle fly. And what is this? Bonus points if you can actually tell me what this is.
It's an other.
It's a what?
It's an other.
It is an other. Can anybody tell me what kind of other it is?
Is it an assassin beetle?
No, it's a foe to your tomatoes. It's a leaf-footed bug.
Oh.
It's in the stink bug family. That's why if you're out there and you squish them, they stink really bad. I hate these things. One little side note, you can plant sunflowers as a trap crop. And if you put some of those in the corner away from where you're growing tomatoes, sometimes it'll draw some of those insects away. But these guys they've got biting and sucking or piercing mouth parts. So they can leave a kind of funky flavor behind if they've been feeding on your tomatoes. So I make every effort to try to get them away from my tomatoes. All right, what's this guy? It's got a fuzzy butt.
Bumblebee.
Bumblebee, very good. That's right. All right, what's this guy? It's got a narrow waist.
Wasp.
Wasp, yes. What's this guy?
It looks like a mimic fly.
Yes. It's a fly. Very good. Hoverfly to be specific. And we can tell it's a fly because it just has the one set of wings versus two. All right, what's this one? Again, bonus
Other.
points if you can tell me what insect it is.
Other and lacewing.
Yes, very good. I'm impressed. Okay, so some of you were bold and volunteered, and some of you didn't want to, and that's perfectly fine. We don't mind. So hopefully you did exactly what you hoped you would do. Again, it's just meant to point out that it's not that difficult. It's actually pretty easy to tell what a lot of these insects are. So how do you do the census? Okay, well, let's go real quick. So this is the lovely marketing guide that Gwinnett County provides us, and it's just a single sheet. It lists all the different counting events that are public. We've got all the community garden counting events. I think they're still needing some help. I want to say, I hope at West Gwinnett, maybe Tequila and Lenora. So if you're on here and you're looking for a volunteer event, you're a master gardener, I know I sent something out today, but they need someone to kind of help lead and train over at those particular community gardens for Harvest Gwinnett. And then I also have the counting events that Extension is sponsoring, or some of the master gardeners. Those are over on the right-hand side at Lawrenceville and Bethesda Senior Center, Creative Enterprises, Isaac Adair, Vines Park, both the community garden and Vines Park, and Creative Enterprises again, and then Slow Pour Brewing in the evening. That's a very popular one. We got something like 60 observations there. That garden is phenomenal, and the pollinators are just off the cuff. So it's pretty cool. And then this has a identification guide. So I can provide this as a digital copy. If anybody's interested, you can reach out to me and I will send you the digital copy, or you can swing by and pick some up if you would like. So it's pretty easy, very, very easy. You're going to pick a blooming pollinator plant with lots of activity. You don't just have to pick one flower. You can pick the whole plant if you want. That's fine. And then you're going to take 15 minutes. So you're going to tell Siri that to set an alarm for 15 minutes, or I don't know what the Android version of Siri is, but set an alarm for 15 minutes. And then you're going to sit there and watch that flower or that plant with those flowers. And you're going to count every single time an insect touches a bloom, even if it flies away and it comes back. So I'll flip back here. You can see here you've got, it says, what's a buzz? And it says select a blooming plant with insect activity. It gives you the directions there, and it gives you the website to go upload your count. It also lists out what all the insects are. So you're just going to do hatch marks and count every single time one touches that plant. So you may have, we had some at Slow Pour last year that I swear they had like 200 observations for one Mexican sunflower plant. It was crazy. It was crazy. So you can see, you can be really busy. You can be bored out of your gourd and have no insects at all, or you could have so many that you just don't ever stop writing when you're doing it during the 15 minutes. So there's a lot of variation. But the nice thing is you can also put in, when you're listing all of that, it also wants the weather conditions, the temperature. It wants, let's look. It wants the pollinator plant and the address, all of that stuff. And it's all very important because that's what allows them to classify that data and keep track of it, so that when they're putting all the charts and the reports together for publishing purposes, they know and exactly, where that particular plant was located. Everything's within a 2-day window. If it's raining, if it's not, they can smooth the data for that. And then when you're done after that 15 minutes, you're just gonna go to ggapc.org. That's where the pollinator census has been housed all along. And they'll have a portal there where you can enter all of that information. And that should open, I think she said, as quickly as the 19th rolls around, that will be open. So you can start uploading your data very quickly after that. And it should be open for at least a couple weeks afterwards. I think we had some master gardeners collect all of the observations and they were going to enter them, but they didn't get them in time. So we had to reach out to Becky Griffin and give them to her offline, which was fine because she's still crunching data. So but try to, if you're going to host an event for yourself or your church or something else or school, try to get them in within the first week after the event so that we don't have to worry about that. But if you don't, you can always reach out to me and I can get it to Becky. So once again, you're going to upload them there to ggapc.org. And there's a lot of resources out there. So if you go to this website, there'll be educational resources. So that's great for teachers or homeschool groups. Lots of good stuff there. You'll find data if you want to use that. There's, curriculum for how to use a lot of this information and interesting links that you can get. There's counts. So we have the counting sheet and all that stuff that Gwinnett County has provided to us, but not every county does that. So if you're outside the county, then you can get counting sheets and ID sheets there. And there's a Facebook page, so you can certainly join now and you can post some pictures. I know it's active all year round. People post pictures there and ask for IDs of particular insects. They post pictures there of their events. Lots of good stuff that you can get there. They'll have, informational stories and things from newspaper articles and other stuff that shows up there. And so you can reach out to Becky Griffin if you need clarification on something, or, maybe you had 100 observations and you forgot you had them in your car, they fell between the seat and you don't want them to go to waste. You can certainly reach out to Becky and she'll find a way to get those. So, but basically mark your calendar. It's coming up quick. It's sneaking up on us and we don't want to miss it because it's going to be really cool. So with that, this is my information. So you know where I am and you can reach out to me at any time. Give me a call, email. Email's probably the better way to get a hold of me. I'm away from my desk a lot, so I can't always grab the phone and we don't get mobile phones. So I'll see here if anybody has anything. No questions so far, but does anybody have any questions? Did I throw something out there that didn't make sense? You can unmute yourself if you have questions and I'm happy to answer. Everybody's so quiet. That's okay. So this is all recorded, so I will post this. And if you want a link to it, you're welcome to shoot me an email and I will get you the link. And you can tell others. I know there were a few people that messaged me earlier today and said that they couldn't be here tonight, but was I going to post a link? And yes, I will be posting a link. So it'll be up there. And I'll probably send out one more big newsletter notification before the pollinator census, just to remind everybody it's coming. And I'll put the link in there if anybody wants to watch. But thank you all for showing up tonight. I really appreciate it. And I hope you all are excited about the pollinator census. I know there are a few teachers out there. I offered last year, if you want this particular presentation, you're welcome to reach out to me and I can share that with you. You don't have to use the whole thing. Sometimes it's fun to just have the insect pictures up there and flash them up there for the kids to see and see if they can guess what they are. Yeah, lots of good stuff and we are here to help you. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and that's basically it. So thanks for coming and I'm going to go ahead and end it. So everybody have a good well, it's not afternoon. Have a good evening.
You too. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Bye.